The daily headlines, if you really read them, I mean, if you let them sink in, it can just feel like this relentless, this exhausting drumbeat of tragedy.
Oh, absolutely. Conflict, selfishness, it's everywhere.
And if you let that digital noise just consume you, you could easily start believing that, human cruelty is the dominant force, the defining constant of our species.
But that would be a failure of observation, really, because happening at the exact same time, there is this magnificent, really powerful counter-narrative.
A flip side to it all.
Exactly. And it's happening all across the globe. It spans from these small, almost invisible, anonymous gestures right up to these massive, dramatic acts of selflessness, of forgiveness.
And that's exactly what our sources are about today, this incredible paradox, the full spectrum of what you could call dramatic human kindness.
Yeah, and the material we have it's just fascinating. On one hand, you have these 10 distinct, really high-profile movements of profound goodness.
Things that delivered, tangible relief or some kind of moral clarity.
Right. And then on the other hand, we have this deep, really rigorous investigation into the legacy of maybe the most scrutinized icon of kindness in modern history.
Which forces you to ask some really hard questions about charity, about morality, about effectiveness.
Before we even get into those grand stories, though, I think we should probably set a baseline with the science.
Okay.
There was this really compelling study back in 2012, and it suggests that kindness might not just be something we learn.
It's innate.
It could actually be rooted in our genes, linked to our survival, our social bonds. So while we all think about everyday kindness, holding a door, letting a car merge,
Paying for the coffee for the person behind you in line.
right, those small things. But there's an entire spectrum here, and it leads all the way up to grand, often self-sacrificing selflessness that, it just transcends simple courtesy.
And that distinction is so crucial, isn't it? Because we're going to explore those extreme highs of that spectrum, those moments when people and whole communities just shine.
And then we have to pivot.
Then we pivot, and we take this forensic, very careful look at the extreme complexity surrounding Mother Teresa. We have to balance her celebrated, almost saintly image
with the extensive, really expert critiques that are all documented in the source material.
It's a mission that really requires you to hold two very different, sometimes completely conflicting narratives in your head at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So we'll begin with the communal stuff, the, immediate reactions to suffering. And we can start with an organization called Project Linus.
Ah, Project Linus.
Yeah.
It's such a beautifully simple concept, but the scope it's achieved is it's astonishing.
It's focused entirely on providing comfort to the most vulnerable. We're talking sick or traumatized babies, kids, and teens.
And their goal is so specific. It's to spread comfort and security. And they do it by delivering homemade blankets and quilts through hospitals, shelters, social services.
It's a tangible thing, a soft comfort offered against these hard, often terrifying realities these kids are facing.
Yeah. What's really remarkable to me is how decentralized it is. This isn't some top-down corporate charity.
Not at all. It operates with local chapters and volunteers who they call blanketeers, which is great in every single state in the U.S.
So the work is really personalized.
Yeah.
Right? Every blanket is unique.
Exactly. But the delivery system itself is highly efficient. It's all about getting these little artifacts of care where they are needed most.
And when you look at the actual numbers in the sources, the impact it's quantifiable. It's significant.
Yeah, take Fayette County, Georgia, for example.
Yeah.
Their local volunteers distributed 1,155 blankets just in their community over just 2 years.
Wow.
And then, even more dramatically, they sent nearly 150 handmade blankets to help children affected by the devastation from Hurricane Sandy back in 2012.
The psychological insight there is just so profound. Because this kindness, for the most part, it's anonymous to the child who gets it.
Right. The kid receiving the blanket just knows that a stranger cared enough to make this for them. There's no expectation of thanks, no connection.
It just addresses that emotional need when they're at their most fragile. It's a silent, handmade symbol of care and security when their whole world has been turned upside down. So moving from that kind of anonymous comfort to a more active, even formidable kind of protection.
Yes.
We have bikers against child abuse. BACA.
Now, this organization, they've been working since 1995, and their goal, it almost sounds like something out of a myth.
It really does.
Yeah.
To literally remove fear from the lives of physically, sexually, and emotionally abused children. And they help fund therapy, too.
But the methodology, I mean, this is where the dramatic label really, really applies.
They're volunteers or bikers, often riding these large, imposing motorcycles.
And they get called in on verified abuse cases, usually by law enforcement or child care agencies. But the critical point, and the sources really emphasize this.
They are not vigilantes.
Absolutely not. They are not vigilantes. They act strictly as bodyguards, as protectors, and always within the bounds of the law.
It's kindness, but it's presented in this deliberately formidable package. I mean, just imagine the emotional shift for a moment.
Right.
You're a vulnerable child. You're living in terror. And then suddenly you have this line of supportive, tough-looking adults, often in leather, on Harley, standing between you and your abuser.
The organization's presence, whether it's at a court proceeding, a parole hearing, or just standing guard outside the kid's house at night.
It's designed to intimidate the abuser and to make that child feel, maybe for the first time, instantaneously safe.
It's just this extraordinary demonstration of protective altruism, and the sources are clear that BKCA doesn't engage with the abusers.
Their power is just in their presence.
Exactly, in their solidarity and presence. And that shift in the power dynamic from, this chronic, paralyzing fear to sudden absolute security, that might be the ultimate act of dramatic communal kindness reacting directly to malice.
Yeah, that model, that communal nonviolent shielding, it brings us right to the next example.
The Westboro counter-protests.
Right. And this was a very specific, very creative reaction to one of the most visible hate groups in the U.S., the Westboro Baptist Church.
Through WBC, yeah. Notorious for picketing military funerals, other high-profile funerals, with just these abhorrent, offensive signs.
So the counteraction that rose up against them is this magnificent study in creative, nonviolent human decency.
It really is, because instead of engaging in confrontation, which is what the WBC wanted,
they wanted the fight.
They wanted the attention.
Yeah.
So communities use these overwhelming, peaceful acts of blockage and distraction instead.
We even saw universities getting involved.
Yeah, students from Vassar and Texas A&M, they formed these silent human chains to literally prevent the protesters from even being seen or heard by the grieving families arriving for the funerals.
And then you have the just incredible creativity of Angel Action.
Oh, this is amazing.
The counter-protesters, they would dress up in these long white robes, and they'd wear these 10-foot-tall angel wings.
And the wings were used to physically surround and just completely block the WBC picketers from the view of the mourners.
It turned what could have been a moment of ugly confrontation into this beautifully surreal, protective tableau.
And the sources also cite a particularly moving example with the Patriot Guard riders.
Yes. These are motorcycle enthusiasts, and many of them are veterans themselves.
And they offered nonviolent protection. They formed these silent protective barriers, for instance, at the funerals of the victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting.
Just to ensure that those grieving families were sheltered. Sheltered from intrusion and hate at what has to be their most vulnerable moment.
It's powerful stuff. And these three examples, Project Linus, BACA, the counter-protesters, they all demonstrate this direct communal kindness that offers comfort, security, or a physical shield.
They're all about immediate intervention. The community stepping up to address a crisis right here, right now.
Exactly.
So now we can shift. We move from that kind of reactive community protection to acts that are defined by profound moral choice.
Integrity, forgiveness, reconciliation. And often under immense pressure and, personal risk.
I don't think there's a better or more radical example of choosing our shared humanity over the demands of conflict than the Christmas truce of 1914.
Yeah. This was during World War I, the very early stages of a conflict that would eventually claim, nearly 17 million lives?
And the sources, they just paint this grim, grim picture of the setting. The trenches on the Western Front, muddy, cold, horrific.
And this was after only 5 months of fighting had already resulted in nearly 1 million deaths. The military machine was just roaring, demanding perpetual slaughter.
And yet,
there was this completely unauthorized, totally spontaneous single-day truce between pockets of British and German soldiers.
it wasn't planned. It wasn't some top-down order.
Not at all. It began so simply. On Christmas Eve, some German trenches started decorating their parapets. They started singing Silent Night.
And the British responded with carols of their own.
And for one temporary day, on December 25th, 1914, there were no shots fired, no bombs exploding.
Instead, you have men from opposing sides climbing out of their trenches into what was known as no man's land.
And shaking hands. They shared cigarettes, they exchanged little gifts, they showed each other pictures of their families.
I read they even kicked a muddy can around, a makeshift football game.
Yes. And they often helped each other bury their dead, who were previously unreachable in that contested space between the trenches.
It was a temporary but just overwhelmingly powerful respite. A choice made by the men in the trenches to recognize a shared humanity, despite this war machine demanding they kill each other.
And the sources note that military command on both sides was furious. They took immediate measures to suppress any chance of it happening again.
Which just highlights how radical that act of kindness and solidarity really was.
It proves that even in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, kindness and solidarity can, break through.
That moral clarity in a moment of total conflict is it's stunning. Let's move to personal integrity, but in a very different kind of high-stakes environment, competitive sports.
Okay, so we're looking at the Kenyan runner, Abel Mutai, and the Spanish runner, Ivan Fernandez Anaya.
Right. During a cross-country race in Spain, this was in 2012.
So Mutai is leading the race. He's clearly fatigued, and he mistakenly stopped short, about 32 feet, something like that, before the actual finish line.
He thought he finished.
He thought he'd won, and Anaya is right behind him, perfectly positioned to just surge past, secure the win, take the gold medal.
But he didn't?
He didn't. Instead, Anaya recognized the error. He catches up to Mutai, he guides him forward, and he physically gestures for him to keep running to the true finish line.
Ensuring Mutai claimed the victory that he had actually earned.
The moral pressure in that fraction of a second. It must have been immense. It was a clear choice between personal victory and integrity.
And when he was asked about it later, Fernandez Anaya just said, very simply, I didn't deserve the win.
He chose honesty, sportsmanship, acknowledging another athlete's effort over capturing a medal that he knew would have been tarnished by the circumstance. That moral calculus, sacrificing a win for a deeper truth, it's staggering.
It is. So next we look at forgiveness on a truly grand, almost inconceivable scale.
Pope John Paul II and his would-be assassin.
Yes. On May 13th, 1981, Mehmet Ali Agca shot the Pope 3 times in St. Peter's Square.
The attack was meant to be fatal. The Pope himself later attributed his survival to the divine intervention of the Virgin Mary.
And the Pope's response wasn't just, some official Vatican statement. It was immediate and deeply personal.
Just 4 days after the attempt, while he was still recovering, he publicly forgave Agca. He said he had done so immediately, in the ambulance, right after he was shot.
But he went even further than that public statement.
He did. 2 years later, in 1983, he visited Agca in prison. He held his hand. He spent time speaking with him face-to-face, offering that pardon personally.
That's an act of mercy shown on the world stage. It demonstrated a kind of spiritual commitment and compassion in the face of a mortal threat.
It sent a message about the power of mercy that just transcended any kind of political or judicial punishment.
A similar world-changing act of reconciliation was offered by Nelson Mandela.
Yes, when he was inaugurated as president of South Africa in 1994, after serving 27 years in prison for his opposition to apartheid.
Mandela had every political reason, every personal reason, to seek retribution against the system that had imprisoned him.
But he didn't. He chose reconciliation as the absolute cornerstone of his new government. And the sources highlight one very specific act.
He invited Christo Brand, who was one of the white guards who had overseen his imprisonment, to his inauguration ceremony.
And not just that, Brand was also invited to the 20th anniversary celebration of Mandela's release.
The power of that single invitation, it can't be overstated.
No, and Brand himself spoke about how this act had a life-changing effect on him. He entered the prison as a young pro-apartheid guard, but Mandela's quiet dignity and forgiveness completely transformed his worldview.
It led him to speak out against racial segregation.
Exactly. Mandela used a personal act of kindness as a global political lesson for reconciliation. He was showing the world that healing has to start with acknowledging the humanity even of your former oppressors.
Okay, so finally we come to what is. It's perhaps the most difficult, most heart-wrenching act of personal forgiveness documented in our sources.
And this takes place in the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide.
This involves a woman named Iphigenia Mukantabana.
And the context here is absolutely essential. The genocide pitted Hutus against Tutsis. It tore the entire social fabric of the country apart.
Mukantabana's husband and her 5 children were slaughtered by a Hutu militia, and among the killers was her own neighbor, a man named Jean Bosco Bizimana.
The victims and perpetrators were people who knew each other. They lived side by side. It just compounds the horror.
So, a decade later, Iphigenia was working in a basket-making business. It was part of the Rwanda Paths to Peace project, and she was working alongside Bizimana's wife.
Bizimana himself had served 7 years in prison for his crimes, and when he was released, he was required to face his community.
And this is where we have to talk about the Gakaka court system, right?
Right. It was a traditional, community-based court system. After the genocide, the formal judicial system just couldn't handle the sheer volume of cases.
So these courts were a mechanism for communal healing, for restorative justice. Perpetrators who confessed could request forgiveness from the victims in a public setting.
And Bizimana's public, deeply personal request for forgiveness at one of these courts is what finally helped Mukantabana to forgive him. She acknowledged she needed to move past the trauma to rebuild her own life.
The psychological cost of that forgiveness is it's unfathomable.
It is. And these acts, from the Christmas truce to this pardon in Rwanda, they are all defined by a selfless choice that results in immediate, tangible moral or emotional relief.
Yeah, they set a really high bar for what dramatic human kindness looks like. They weren't concerned with building a global empire or a brand.
No.
They were concerned with immediate, undeniable moral good.
Which brings us to our transition from these clear-cut acts of integrity and forgiveness to perhaps the most complex, debated figure synonymous with charity.
Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa. Her story forces us to look beyond the simple narrative of sainthood and see just how complicated charity can become when it intersects with global power, wealth, and ideology.
Her global reputation was, it was immense, and it was largely flawless during her lifetime. Agnes Gokshebojaksiu, an Albanian Indian woman born in Skopje in 1910.
And she achieved a kind of worldwide veneration that very few living people ever receive.
The list of accolades just speaks to that stature. She won the 1979 Nobel Peace Prize. She got India's highest civilian award, the Bharat Ratna, in 1980.
And she was ranked number 5 in Outlook India's 2012 Greatest Indian Poll.
And then her image was officially solidified by the Catholic Church. Beatified in 2003, canonized as Saint Teresa of Calcutta by Pope Francis in 2016.
Her feast day is now observed globally on September 5th.
And the sheer scope of the institution she built, the Missionaries of Charity, or OMC, it's just staggering.
She founded it in India in 1948. By the time of her death in 1997, it had just ballooned to over 4,000 sisters, 300 brothers, operating 610 missions in 123 countries.
That network included hospices, orphanages, AIDS hospices, care facilities for the disabled, refugees, victims of famine and epidemics.
And it wasn't just nuns and brothers. They established a contemplative branch and they drew in lay co-workers. By the 1990s, that was over 1 million people.
The sheer administrative and logistical genius that's required to manage an organization of that scale is, in itself, extraordinary.
Absolutely.
She defined her identity with that famous quote, the one that seems to capture the simplicity the public so admired.
By blood, I am Albanian. By citizenship, an Indian. By faith, I am a Catholic nun. As to my heart, I belong entirely to the heart of Jesus. It's powerful. And Pope John Paul II publicly praised her faith as the inexhaustible source of her strength. He said her time in prayer didn't detract from her service. It was the very source of her ability to serve.
To the world, she was the epitome of unwavering spiritual devotion, a figure of pure, uncomplicated faith dedicated to the poor.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Because the contrast between that public identity and her private spiritual life it's profound. And frankly, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, the correspondence that was compiled in the book, Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light, it revealed this hidden, nearly 50-year struggle.
With what the church calls the dark night of the soul.
And it wasn't just a fleeting doubt. She experienced a chronic, debilitating sense of emptiness, a profound silence of God, and pain over her lack of faith for almost half a century.
Even as she was winning the Nobel Peace Prize and running a global charity.
Right. Her correspondence with her spiritual confidants detailed this spiritual agony. And the sources cite these deeply personal requests from her. She actually asked that these letters, the ones revealing her doubt, be destroyed after her death.
She was deeply concerned that if the public knew, they would think more of me, less of Jesus.
She feared her personal struggle would detract from the message of faith she worked so hard to embody.
She wrote these poignant notes like, Jesus has a very special love for you. But as for me, the silence and the emptiness is so great that I look and do not see, listen, and do not hear. The tongue moves in prayer, but does not speak.
It just paints this picture of intense, sustained internal suffering that was completely hidden beneath this public veneer of pure, simple, triumphant faith.
And that paradox right there is what sets the stage for the critique of her public mission.
Okay, so now we have to pivot. We have to look at the highly rigorous, documented criticism that fundamentally complicates this saintly narrative.
Yeah, and it's important to acknowledge the credentials of the critics here.
Absolutely. The two primary figures, the journalist Christopher Hitchens and the Indian physician Dr. Arup Chatterjee, they both served in the formal role of devil's advocates during the beatification process.
And that's a crucial clarification. The devil's advocate, or the promoter of the faith, is a mandated role in the church's process. It's designed to raise critical evidence against a candidate's sanctity.
So their job was literally to argue against her.
It was, and Hitchens' documentary Hell's Angel and his book The Missionary Position, along with Chatterjee's book The Final Verdict, they really form the foundation of the modern skepticism.
Alongside a major analytical study from the Université de Montréal.
Right, so these weren't just fringe dissenters. They were mandated to rigorously test her legacy.
So let's start with the theological heart of it all, the critique of her philosophy of suffering.
Yeah, this seems to be the core ideological issue that critics argue directly justified substandard care in her facilities.
The core belief, which is cited everywhere by the critics, was that suffering was spiritually beneficial.
Yes. Mother Teresa stated, "There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot, to suffer it like Christ's passion. The world gains much from their suffering."
She also said that pain and suffering are only the kiss of Jesus.
That's a key operational doctrine. Suffering wasn't just to be tolerated or managed, it was glorified as a direct route to spiritual salvation.
That is just a staggering belief when you're dealing with preventable medical suffering.
It is. But the contradiction that critics immediately seized on is what happened when Mother Teresa herself was gravely ill.
Right.
When she needed palliative care for severe heart problems in the 90s, she received the absolute highest level of modern, sophisticated medical intervention and pain relief.
She was admitted to a modern, expensive American hospital.
Precisely. And critics argued her own choice for treatment stood in stark opposition to the philosophy of pain she demanded the poor accept. If suffering was the kiss of Jesus, why did she reject that kiss in favor of advanced secular medicine?
This inconsistency leads directly into the devastating critiques about the quality of care in her missions.
Which doctors and medical professionals who visited them often described not as modern hospitals, but as homes for the dying.
The conditions were regularly described as unfit. Patients were reportedly left without appropriate medical treatment, lacking basic hygiene, adequate food, and critically modern painkillers.
Because the rationale is that painkillers interfered with the process of spiritual suffering.
And the sources give these harrowing details about sanitation. Doctors saw children tied to beds because there weren't enough staff to watch them.
There were shocking sanitation practices, like blankets stained with feces being washed in the same sink used for cleaning dishes.
And this wasn't just a matter of not having enough resources, it was a matter of methodology.
Multiple sources, including direct testimony from former volunteers, pointed to the dangerous, publicly acknowledged practice of reusing hypodermic needles.
Reusing needles.
Reusing needles. And in Calcutta, Dr. Chatterjee noted that the nurses often didn't even speak the language of the patients, and medical care was mostly done by untrained foreign volunteers who lacked even the most rudimentary medical knowledge.
So the ideology of suffering, it seems, superseded basic medical ethics, basic public health concerns.
And Chatterjee also found this huge discrepancy between the myth and the reality in Kolkata.
The famous Calcutta hospice, the one that was the centerpiece of her worldwide reputation,
Was actually very small. It accommodated only about 80 beds, and it provided extremely limited medical care. It was functioning primarily as a rest home for people who were nearing death.
So that severely undermines the heroic image of her organization curing the masses in India.
And this feeds right into the issue of exaggerated claims and how resources were used.
Mother Teresa reportedly gave these wildly varying inflated figures for how many people her order fed daily.
Yeah, in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, she claimed anywhere from 4,000 to 9,000 people.
But investigators found that her soup kitchens fed a maximum of only 300. and they primarily catered to the Catholic poor who had specific food cards.
And what's more, while her order did have ambulances, the sources allege they were primarily used to transport nuns to and from prayer or to their residences.
Not for picking up the dying from the streets, which is what she told Western audiences was a routine part of her mission.
The prioritization of the organization's needs over medical infrastructure, it's a recurring theme.
Okay, so the third major area of criticism, and this one is perhaps the most corrosive. It's about financial integrity and questionable political alliances.
Right. The missionaries of charity raised hundreds of millions of dollars globally.
And when critics like Hitchens and Chatterjee looked at the facilities, the lack of modern equipment, the shortage of medicine, the poor hygiene, they consistently saw a massive shortage of actual care relative to this huge inflow of money.
Which immediately raises the question that has defined the skepticism for decades. Where did the hundreds of millions of dollars go?
The sources detail accusations that the funds were prioritized for the organization itself. Specifically, building and maintaining over 250 residences for the nuns.
Rather than establishing modern medical infrastructure like clinics or hospitals that could effectively treat the illnesses she was supposed to be alleviating.
And the source of those funds was, at times, highly problematic.
Very. She knowingly accepted large, questionable donations from drug peddlers and swindlers. Most notably, she got $1.25 million from Charles Keating,
the central figure in the 1980s savings and loan crisis in the U.S., which cost American taxpayers billions.
And when Keating was on trial, she wrote to the presiding judge seeking clemency for him. She praised his kindness to God's poor.
This drew the ire of the prosecuting attorney, Paul Turley. He wrote directly to Mother Teresa.
He did, and he pointed out that the money Keating donated was stolen from thousands of working-class people. He urged her to demonstrate the true Christian spirit by returning the stolen money to the cheated victims,
including one poor carpenter who had lost his entire life savings.
And the sources show she refused to respond to Turley's letter, and she never returned the stolen money.
Which critics used as evidence that her commitment to the financial well-being of her own organization superseded her moral obligation to the poor who were victimized by her donors.
Her political alignment also attracted intense scrutiny. Critics noted her acceptance of funds from dictators, like Haiti's Jean-Claude Duvalier,
whom she publicly praised for his love of the poor.
Right. And this acceptance of money from morally compromised sources, coupled with these highly visible alliances with conservative Western leaders like Thatcher and Reagan, it led critics to argue her mission was fundamentally blurred with political goals.
Her outspoken, unwavering opposition to abortion, contraception, and divorce views that are indistinguishable from the official Catholic position was often leveraged, using her global humanitarian fame.
Critics argued she used her pedestal not just for general charity, but to actively push a specific, inflexible religious and political agenda on a global scale.
And finally, the critique extended to the very process of her sainthood.
Yes. The Church's canonization process requires the individual to be responsible for 2 verified miracles that happen after their death.
And both of the required miracles have been subjected to significant scientific and journalistic dispute.
The first miracle cure in 2002 involved an Indian woman named Monica Bezra. Her own physician asserted publicly that her cancer was cured with standard medical drugs and treatment she got at the hospital.
Not divine intervention.
Exactly. But the Church dismissed this medical objection and proceeded with the beatification anyway, which led a lot of journalists and skeptics to question the whole verification process underpinning her path to sainthood. So we've reached this really profound point of contradiction. You have a woman who inspired millions, who built a massive global organization fueled by hundreds of millions of dollars.
And yet simultaneously maintained a philosophy of suffering that critics argue perpetuated medical neglect.
And whose finances were entangled with political expediency. So how do we synthesize all of this? Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to confront the concept that Christopher Hitchens called the Western gaze.
The Western gaze. What did he mean by that?
He argued that Mother Teresa was venerated in the West not so much for the actual effectiveness of her deeds on the ground, but for the comforting perception that someone was there, helping the poor in a developing nation.
So Hitchens argued she turned Indian poverty into a moral spectacle.
Yes, and that she operated as a living virtue signal for Western audiences, allowing them to feel charitable without having to confront the complex, systemic causes of global poverty or colonialism.
The Indian physician Chatterjee, he corroborated this, didn't he? He noted she was far more of a globally celebrated phenomenon in the West than she ever was in her adopted city of Kolkata.
The myth was more comfortable than the reality. It provided this simplified, powerful narrative of selfless devotion, which conveniently masked the need for systemic change or effective, large-scale medical infrastructure.
But the academic study from the University de Montreal, while it confirmed the core criticisms about care quality and finances, it did acknowledge a crucial theoretical positive effect.
Right, which is that the sheer myth of Mother Teresa's extraordinary image, regardless of how effective her own order was.
It might have encouraged and inspired genuinely engaged humanitarian initiatives that truly did relieve suffering elsewhere in the world.
Exactly. Foundations, NGOs, medical missions that prioritized modern, effective care. The inspiration was real, even if the model wasn't perfect.
And you also have to consider the Church's motivation in her rapid ascent to sainthood.
Sources suggest the Vatican really pushed her canonization in 2016, following several high-profile clerical scandals in the preceding decades.
Because they needed a figure of pure, unquestionable faith, a clean, modern rallying point for believers globally.
Her unwavering spiritual facade made her the perfect modern champion, even despite the private evidence of her own 50 years of agonizing spiritual doubt.
What's fascinating here is moral paradox that emerges when we contrast her with those other examples we discussed at the start.
Yeah.
We began this deep dive with acts defined by tangible relief and selfless integrity. The Christmas truce, the runner choosing honesty, Mkatabatta's painful reconciliation.
Those acts delivered immediate, clear, non-negotiable good. Safety, honesty, peace.
By contrast, Mother Teresa's simple motto, to care for the hungry, the naked, the homeless, was, according to the sources, fundamentally undermined by her ideological commitment to spiritual salvation through suffering.
And the sources compel you to ask, is it possible for a person who inspires immense good purely through their image and their myth to simultaneously embody ethical compromises that directly lead to concrete, untreated suffering?
Can love alone actually sterilize needles or fund antibiotics? The critique suggests that in the realm of tangible human needs, pain, disease, starvation, pure faith, if it's coupled with a glorification of pain and a resistance to modern medicine, is simply insufficient.
Regardless of the devotion of the individual.
The intentions, while deeply devoted, did not always translate to humane, effective outcomes.
And that forces you to define what you mean by dramatic kindness. Is it the intention, the image, or is it the measurable result?
The other 9 acts of kindness resulted in an immediate, clear benefit to the recipient.
Whereas Mother Teresa's work, according to her critics, often prioritized the spiritual benefit of the caregiver and the dying patient's soul over their physical comfort or their chance of recovery. That is the fundamental ethical difference at the heart of this paradox.
It's a powerful lesson in distinguishing between charity as, say, a religious practice focused on salvation, and aid as a humanitarian practice focused on life preservation and maximizing human comfort. So we began this deep dive with simple, radical acts of profound human kindness. A runner sacrificing a victory, soldiers shaking hands across enemy lines, a former prisoner inviting his jailer to his inauguration.
And these acts were all defined by their immediate measurable impact and their, moral purity.
And we end with a figure whose monumental kindness became inextricably linked with global fame, immense wealth, complicated international politics, and a highly debatable philosophy on the nature of human suffering.
Her legacy is one of unwavering devotion, but also painful contradiction.
The sources show that Mother Teresa was deeply complex, suffering privately while inspiring millions publicly. Her story is a perfect reflection of our societal desire for simple heroes.
Icons who save us from the chaos and simplify the complex, resource-intensive task of doing good.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought. Does true dramatic kindness require flawless motivation and perfectly measurable effective outcomes? Or is the inspiration derived from the myth sometimes more impactful than the measurable reality of the deed?
And in our eagerness to claim heroes and simplify the narrative of saving the world, what are you willing to overlook for the sake of an inspiring story? It's a question that asks you to define what truly matters when evaluating a life dedicated to service.